The beginning in the coastal city of 1992. In the summer of 1992, Greystone, a picturesque coastal city tucked along the Atlantic shoreline, was alive with its usual rhythm. Known for its Victorian architecture, bustling harbor, and its annual summer festival, Greystone was the epitome of small-town America, a place where folks waved at each other from their front porches, and shopkeepers knew their customers by name. But on the morning of August 12th, the soft tranquility of Greystone was shattered. The sound of live jazz spilling from the town square faded into nothing but whispers, rumors, and a cloak of unease when the news broke. Melissa Harper, a rising star in the literary scene, had been found dead in her own home. Melissa wasn't just any resident of Greystone. At 29, she was a local icon. Critics called her the voice of her generation, and her debut novel had drawn comparisons to the likes of Joan Didion and Sylvia Plath. To those who knew her, she was charming, witty, and deeply private, someone who could light a room with her stories yet kept a guarded heart. She'd returned to Greystone from Boston a few years earlier, determined to escape the chaos of the urban grind and channel her creativity into the serenity of her childhood town. That particular August morning started like so many other summer days in Greystone. Early risers walked along the cobblestone streets carrying cups of steaming coffee while fishermen docked their boats, their catches still glistening with salt water. But at 6:45 a.m., a 911 operator received an anonymous call. The voice on the line was shaken, whispering, "There's been a murder." When asked for more details, the caller hung up, leaving the dispatcher scrambling to trace the origin of the call. By the time local police arrived at Melissa's quaint cedar-shingled home on Sycamore Lane, dawn was breaking over the harbor. Crowds of curious onlookers had already begun to gather, murmuring questions to one another. Melissa's house, perched atop a gentle hill, was surrounded by lush hydrangeas that had bloomed lavender, oblivious to the tragedy inside. Officer David Hargrove, a lifelong Greystone resident, was the first to enter the home. What awaited him would haunt him for years. The living room, usually a space of warmth and comfort, was in utter disarray. Books lay scattered across the floor, a coffee table had been overturned, and a shattered glass vase spilled water across a dark hardwood surface. And in the center of it all lay Melissa, barefoot, dressed in a tank top and linen shorts soaked in crimson. Detective Evelyn Carson, the lead investigator assigned to the case, described Melissa's home as eerily quiet, despite the visible signs of a struggle. To Evelyn, a seasoned detective with a sharp mind and a reputation for solving some of the region's toughest cases, something felt off. Almost as if Melissa herself had played a role in setting the scene. It didn't look like just chaos, she would later recall in an interview. It looked performative, like someone wanted us to think something specific had happened. The town quickly became an emotional whirlwind. For some, Melissa's death was an incomprehensible tragedy, the end of a bright young life gone too soon. For others, it was terrifying proof that no one, not even in the idyllic pockets of coastal America, was ever truly safe. By noon that same day, yellow caution tape cordoned off Melissa's neighborhood as media vans began to arrive. Local reporters from the Greystone Gazette scrambled for exclusive details, while the bigger networks from Boston and New York prepared to turn this into national news. Chief of Police George Tanner held an immediate press conference outside the station amidst flashing cameras and shouted questions. "This town," he said somberly, his voice steady yet filled with an undercurrent of determination, "has always been a safe place. The events of this morning are not a reflection of who we are as a community. Let me be clear, we will not rest until justice is served." But behind closed doors, Tanner and his department were less confident. What kind of person could have committed such a heinous act in a town like Greystone? And more importantly, why Melissa? She had no known enemies. Neighbors described her as quiet but polite, immersed in her writing and rarely seen with anyone besides her close circle of friends. As crime scene investigators swept through the house, several critical pieces of evidence began to surface. A bloodied knife on the living room table, two distinct sets of footprints leading in and out of the house, and a page from Melissa's handwritten journal, torn and crumpled in the corner. It read cryptically, "Trust him? Who was him, and why had she questioned him?" While these clues seemed tantalizing, they only served to deepen the mystery. Greystone's small police department wasn't equipped to deal with a case on this scale. Within hours, state detectives and forensic analysts were called in to assist, including experts to analyze the footprints and handwriting. What no one could have anticipated, however, was the swirling storm of accusations and lies that would soon envelop the investigation. Melissa's life, once perceived as tranquil and private, turned out to be intertwined with secrets that many in Greystone had worked hard to keep buried. And so began the unraveling of Greystone's perfect image, a murder that would come to haunt the town forever, and two suspects whose intertwining stories would leave everyone questioning what really happened on that fateful summer morning. The chaotic and mysterious crime scene Sycamore Lane was a street that could have been pulled right from the pages of a postcard. Lush, canopying trees lined both sides, and the neat, cedar-shingled homes evoked a sense of timelessness and security. But on the morning of August 12, 1992, all sense of calm had vanished. By 7 a.m., yellow caution tape was strung across Melissa Harper's property. Police cars were parked haphazardly along the quiet street, their red and blue lights reflecting off the Ford station wagons and Volvos of curious neighbors who clustered at the edges of the taped-off area. Inside the home, however, the scene was anything but orderly. Officer David Hargrove, the first responder dispatched to the site, later described his initial walk through the house as stepping into a waking nightmare. The living room, which should have spoken of Melissa's refined taste and calm demeanor, was now a portrait of chaos. Glossy hardcover books from her floor-to-ceiling bookshelf were scattered across the floor, some pages torn and crumpled, others with faint traces of what could only be blood. A small wooden coffee table lay on its side, the glass it once held having shattered into unrecognizable shards. In the center of the room, beneath the wide ceiling fan which lazily spun in the humid morning air, Melissa's lifeless body was sprawled on the dark hardwood floor. Melissa appeared as if she had fallen mid-step, barefoot, dressed in a cotton tank top and linen shorts, the kind of outfit someone would throw on for a quiet evening at home. But her clothing was soaked in blood, which had pooled around her torso, tracing its way into the grooves of the floorboards. Her head was turned slightly to the side, her auburn hair matted with redness that had long since dried. What haunted Hargrove the most was her expression. Her wide, unblinking eyes seemed frozen in shock, staring out at nothing. Beyond her lifeless form, the room had other tales to tell. An old vase, which neighbors later identified as part of a family heirloom Melissa adored, lay smashed near the edge of the room, its once bright hydrangeas now scattered carelessly across the floor. A floor lamp stood at a bizarre angle, its shade crumpled, the bulb broken. On the large wooden coffee table at the center of the room, a knife rested ominously, the blade stained crimson and the handle smeared with something that forensics would later confirm as fingerprints belonging to two different individuals. Detective Evelyn Carson arrived shortly after 7:30 a.m. As she walked through the entryway, her experienced eyes scanned everything. No detail was too small, no misplaced object too innocent. To her, the room told a story, but one that felt rehearsed, almost theatrical. The scene didn't just look like there had been a struggle, she would later tell reporters during a press conference. It felt deliberate, as if someone wanted us to believe something specific about what had happened. Hargrove's initial report had noted two sets of footprints in the thin layer of dust near the back entrance. One was larger, likely a man's, while the other was smaller, possibly a woman's. What struck everyone as peculiar, however, was the way these prints were layered. The larger set seemed fresher, more distinct, as if whoever it belonged to had lingered longer or arrived later. The smaller set appeared disjointed, as if its maker had moved in a hurry or fear. The apparent randomness of the struggle was only heightened by the state of the kitchen. There, on a granite countertop, another knife had been left, smaller than the one in the living room but similarly blood-stained. The fridge was slightly ajar, its magnetic seal failing to keep the door fully closed. A bottle of wine stood uncorked on the counter, next to a single glass with red lipstick stains on the rim. As the forensic team began combing through the house, they discovered yet another chilling detail. Nestled in a corner of the living room behind the overturned coffee table was a notebook. It was Melissa's journal, filled with pages of notes, sketches, and what appeared to be fragments of an unfinished novel, but it was a single torn page that caught Carson's eye. The paper had been crumpled carelessly and thrown aside, but its scrawled words loomed ominously. Trust him? Who was him? And why had she questioned trusting him in the moments leading up to her death? This cryptic clue only deepened the sense of mystery and unease surrounding the scene. Meanwhile, outside the house, the murmuring crowd grew larger as word spread quicker than wildfire through the small town. The once quiet Sycamore Lane became a sea of speculative whispers and theories. Melissa had always seemed so private, yet approachable. Who would want her dead? Gossip from nearby neighbors hinted at her past relationships. The ambitious but volatile ex-boyfriend, Victor Lewis, and the enigmatic yet charming best friend, Jordan Parker. Both men had visited Melissa's home within days of her death. Could one of them have been the last person she saw? As Carson inspected the scene further, she couldn't escape the feeling that something crucial was missing, a piece of the puzzle that would make the chaos make sense. "This house is more than just a crime scene," she confided to Hargrove as they stared at the dark stains seeping into the wood grain. "It's a stage, and right now, we don't know who the director is." The testimony of the best friend. By the afternoon of August 12th, the investigation was in full swing. As officers worked the crime scene, Detective Evelyn Carson knew she needed answers fast. The footprint evidence suggested more than one person had been in Melissa Harper's house around the time of her death. The leads were slim, but there was one name that kept surfacing: Jordan Parker, Melissa's best friend and creative confidant. Jordan wasn't a stranger to anyone in Greystone. He had a natural flair for storytelling, the kind of guy who could charm his way into any conversation. A struggling screenwriter, Jordan frequently collaborated with Melissa on ideas, sharing aspirations of one day creating something memorable together. It wasn't unusual for him to drop by her house for long brainstorming sessions, but now, his connection to Melissa had cast a suspicious shadow over him. When summoned to the Greystone Police Department, Jordan arrived promptly that evening, his face pale and taut with tension. Sitting across from Detective Carson in the small interrogation room, he appeared composed but visibly nervous, his hands fidgeting as he held his coffee cup tightly. "Mr. Parker," Carson began, her voice steady and calm, "we understand that you were close with Miss Harper, and we appreciate you coming in to help us with this investigation." "Of course," Jordan replied, his voice soft but trembling. "Melissa she was like family to me. I'll do whatever I can to help." "Good," Carson said, leaning back slightly in her chair. "Let's start with your relationship. When was the last time you saw Melissa?" Jordan took a deep breath, visibly trying to collect his thoughts. "Last night," he said finally. "I was at her place. I went over around 8 o'clock to talk about a project we'd been working on. A book idea she wanted to develop." Carson scribbled something into her notebook, then glanced up over her glasses. "And how long were you there?" "A few hours," Jordan replied. "We had wine, talked through some of her ideas, laughed a bit, nothing unusual. I think it was close to midnight when..." He trailed off, swallowing hard before continuing. "When Victor showed up." "Victor," Carson repeated. "Victor Lewis, her ex-boyfriend?" Jordan nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, he wasn't supposed to be there, obviously. I mean, Melissa broke up with him months ago, but he just barged in completely uninvited." Carson leaned forward slightly, her pen pausing mid-air. "What happened when he arrived?" "He looked furious," Jordan said, his voice growing more emphatic. "He started yelling, accusing her of cutting him out, ignoring his calls. I tried to calm him down, but he wasn't listening. Melissa was getting upset. She asked him to leave." "And did he?" Carson pressed. Jordan hesitated, his eyes darting to the table as if searching for the right way to phrase his response. "Eventually, yes. But not before things got heated." He looked back up at Carson. "He shoved me. It wasn't much, but enough to make it clear he wasn't happy I was there. Then he stormed out, slamming the door behind him." Carson tapped her pen lightly against her notebook. "And what happened after he left?" Jordan shrugged, gripping his coffee cup tighter. "We talked for a bit, tried to make sense of what just happened. Melissa didn't seem too shaken. She had a way of brushing things off. I left shortly after, around 12:30. She said she wanted to get some sleep." Carson studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "So you had no idea anything was wrong until..." She let the question hang in the air. "Until I heard the news this morning," Jordan finished, his voice cracking slightly. "God, I couldn't believe it. Who would do something like this to her?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Carson replied, jotting down more notes. "You said you left around 12:30. Can anyone confirm that?" Jordan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I mean, I called a cab. The driver might remember me. Other than that..." He trailed off, his hands clutching the coffee cup like a lifeline. Carson made a note to follow up on the cab company, then she tilted her head slightly, watching his reactions carefully. "Jordan, is there anything else you're not telling me? Anything you remember, even if it seems small or unimportant?" Jordan shook his head quickly. "No, I swear that's everything. I loved Melissa, I'd never hurt her." Carson nodded slowly, but her expression remained skeptical. "One more question," she said. Do you know if Melissa kept a journal? A journal? Jordan frowned, his brows furrowing. Yeah, she always had one. She called it her idea vault. Why? We found a page from her journal at the scene, Carson said, watching his reaction carefully. It said, "Trust him?" Do you know what that might mean? Jordan's face drained of color. For a moment he looked like he might be sick. I don't know, he stammered. Melissa didn't tell me everything. Maybe she was talking about Victor? Maybe, Carson said, her tone neutral. But we're going to need more than guesses, Mr. Parker. As Carson wrapped up the interview, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jordan wasn't telling her everything. His emotions felt genuine, but there was something in the way he avoided her gaze when certain questions came up, something that suggested he was holding back. Was it guilt, fear, or something more sinister? When Jordan left the station an hour later, Carson sat alone in the dimly lit interrogation room, replaying his testimony in her mind. On paper, his story seemed plausible, but there were too many unanswered questions. Why had Melissa written "trust him" in her journal? Why did Jordan seem so rattled when she mentioned it? Carson knew one thing for certain. Either Jordan was telling the truth, or he was an incredible actor. And in a case like this, it was her job to figure out which. The contradictory testimony from Victor Lewis arrived at the Greystone Police Department later that evening, hours after Jordan Parker's uneasy interview. Unlike Jordan, Victor didn't seem as anxious upon entering the station. The former real estate agent appeared calm, even defiant, as if the mere idea of being a suspect in Melissa Harper's death was preposterous to him. With his pressed navy blazer and perfectly combed dark hair, he looked more prepared for a negotiation than an interrogation. Detective Evelyn Carson, not one to be swayed by appearances, sized him up as he took a seat in the same dimly lit interrogation room where Jordan had been hours before. Victor lounged back in the chair, his posture more confident than the circumstances warranted, though his dark eyes held an icy mix of frustration and something harder to pinpoint. Regret, perhaps? "Mr. Lewis," Carson started, her voice calm but firm, "thank you for coming in today. I understand confronting this situation must be difficult." "I'm happy to help," Victor interrupted smoothly, his tone betraying no hint of real grief. "Though I have to admit, Detective, I don't understand why I'm even here. Melissa and I had a history, sure, but that ended months ago." Carson didn't flinch at his rehearsed response. "We're speaking with everyone who was close to Miss Harper. This is standard procedure." Victor leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "Of course. I want to see justice served as much as anyone. Melissa didn't deserve—" His voice caught slightly, the first fracture in his confident facade. "She didn't deserve what happened." "That's why we're here," Carson replied evenly. "Let's start at the beginning. When did you last see Melissa?" Victor hesitated. It was subtle, but Carson caught it immediately. He broke eye contact, looking briefly at the table as he answered. "Last night, around midnight, I stopped by her house." "Why?" Carson asked, her pen poised over her notepad. "I wanted to talk to her," Victor admitted. "To apologize, maybe clear the air between us. Things ended, well, they didn't end as cleanly as I would have liked." Carson tilted her head, her tone remaining neutral. "By clear the air, do you mean you wanted to rekindle things?" "No," Victor said quickly, but his slight frown suggested otherwise. "I know Melissa had moved on. I've moved on too. This wasn't about getting back together. It was about closure. I thought we both needed it." Carson scribbled a note, glancing back up at him. "What happened when you arrived at her house?" Victor shifted in his chair, breaking the calm demeanor he'd carried before. "I knocked. No one answered right away. The porch light was on and I could see shadows moving inside. Eventually Jordan opened the door." "Jordan Parker?" Carson clarified, her pen stopping mid-note. "Melissa's best friend?" "Yes," Victor replied, his jaw tightening slightly. He looked unsettled, sweaty, like he'd been pacing or something. I thought it was odd, but before I could ask anything, he told me to leave. "Did you see Melissa?" Carson pressed. "Not at first," Victor said, his tone steady. "But as I looked past Jordan I could see her. She was on the floor, in the living room. It was horrifying." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. There was blood everywhere. Carson's pen paused on the page. She leaned forward slightly, her professional mask hiding the unease brewing in her gut. "So you're saying Melissa was already dead when you arrived?" "Yes," Victor said firmly. "That's exactly what I'm saying. It was Jordan. He must have done it." Carson raised an eyebrow, her voice calm but pointed. "You're accusing Mr. Parker? What makes you so certain?" "Because he was there, standing over her. Victor snapped, his composure slipping. And because of the way he acted, nervous, jumpy, like he'd been caught. He tried to shut the door on me, but I wouldn't let him. I demanded to know what happened, and he just kept saying, "You need to leave," over and over. Carson leaned back, letting a moment of silence hang in the air before she spoke. "What did you do next?" "I left," Victor admitted, his voice quieter now. "I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but then I realized, with our history, I'd automatically be a suspect. And look, here I am." Carson studied his face, her sharp eyes searching for cracks in his explanation. "So, you went home? Did anyone see you after you left?" Victor hesitated, his confidence faltering again. No, I didn't see anyone. I went straight home and I stayed there." "Alone?" Carson asked, her tone neutral but probing. "Yes, alone," Victor replied defensively. "I've got nothing to hide, Detective. Melissa meant a lot to me. I'd never—" "Never hurt her?" Carson interrupted, her gaze locking with his. For the first time, Victor seemed genuinely unnerved. His lips parted, but no words came immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone was quieter, less sure. "Yes, I'd never hurt her," Carson gestured to her notepad, where she'd been meticulously recording his responses. "You said Jordan was acting nervous when you arrived. Did he say anything about what had happened to Melissa?" "He didn't have to," Victor replied quickly. "It was obvious, he was guilty. Why else would he act that way?" Carson set her pen down, folding her hands on the table as she studied Victor in silence. Everything about his body language, the slight tapping of his foot, the way his hands clenched in his lap, suggested he was holding something back. But was it guilt? Or just fear of being implicated? "One more question, Mr. Lewis," Carson said finally. "Do you know if Melissa kept a journal?" Victor frowned, caught off guard by the shift in focus. "Yeah, she always had one. She used to write in it all the time when we were together." "Why?" "We found a page from it at the scene," Carson said, carefully watching his reaction. "It said, 'Trust him?' Does that mean anything to you?" Victor blinked, his expression genuinely puzzled. "Trust who? Me? Jordan? I don't know, that doesn't make any sense." Carson made a note, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Lewis. That'll be all for now." As Victor left the station, Carson couldn't shake the feeling that his story, while polished on the surface, had pieces that didn't quite fit. His insistence on Jordan's guilt felt almost rehearsed, but his reaction to the journal entry seemed genuine. Was he lying to protect himself, or had he stumbled onto a scene made to incriminate him? One thing was clear to Carson. Victor and Jordan's stories couldn't both be true. And somewhere in the tangle of lies and half-truths was the key to what really happened that night. The police hit a dead end. The first week after Melissa Harper's chilling murder, every corner of Greystone brimmed with rumors and theories. In a town where everybody knew each other, or thought they did, shock turned to speculation. Everyone wanted answers, but the police only had fragments of a puzzle no one could piece together. Despite intense questioning of both Victor Lewis and Jordan Parker, each man's testimony pointed the finger directly at the other. Their stories, full of contradictions and personal grievances, only cast thicker shadows over already murky waters. Detective Evelyn Carson, a seasoned investigator who had built her career turning scattered evidence into airtight cases, found herself in uncharted territory. "It's like trying to solve a riddle where the words keep changing," she muttered to herself one evening as she pored over photos from the crime scene. The problem wasn't the lack of evidence, it was the sheer volume of contradictory leads. Blood samples, footprints, and even Melissa's cryptic journal note could all be interpreted in different ways, depending on whose version of events you chose to believe. The key pieces of evidence, 2 sets of bloody footprints leading in and out of Melissa's house, a journal torn open to the oblique question, "Trust him?" and a blade-bearing fingerprints from both suspects, should have provided answers. But instead, they only raised questions. Forensics confirmed that Victor and Jordan had both been in the house that night. The exact timeline, however, was still up for debate. Victor claimed he stumbled onto the gruesome scene and saw Jordan hovering near Melissa's body. Jordan, on the other hand, insisted that Victor arrived angry, violent, and determined to confront Melissa. Neither story held together completely, and neither man had an alibi strong enough to absolve them. As the days turned into weeks, the once bustling police investigation started to slow. Leads that initially seemed promising fizzled out. The cab driver Jordan mentioned, he couldn't recall dropping anyone off near Sycamore Lane that night. The neighbors who might have heard or seen something? They only remembered faint shouting but couldn't confirm the exact time or identify who was involved. Even the knife, the presumed murder weapon, provided little clarity. While it bore fingerprints, they were a mix of Melissa's, Victor's, and Jordan's. Hardly surprising given how often the three had interacted before the tragedy. Chief George Tanner, a veteran of the force who had seen more than his fair share of small-town crimes, was beginning to feel the pressure. In his crisp button-down shirt and ever-present scowl, he addressed the growing crowd of reporters outside the police station for the third time in a month. "We are committed to finding justice for Melissa Harper," he declared. But his words rang hollow, even to him. Behind closed doors he confessed to Carson, "The longer this drags on, the less certain I am we'll ever get a clear answer." The community of Greystone, initially united in grief, began to fracture as doubt spread. Some locals sided with Jordan, branding Victor as a jealous ex who'd lost control. Others found Jordan's calm, collected facade suspicious, painting him as a manipulative opportunist who had been plotting against Melissa for months. Whispers circulated in coffee shops, at church gatherings, and along the boardwalk. Was this the result of a lover's quarrel, a crime of passion, or was there something no one had considered, someone else entirely who had reason to harm Melissa? Carson herself wasn't immune to the unease gripping the town. She spent sleepless nights wrestling with the case. Was Victor lying outright, or had his arrogant demeanor simply clouded her judgment? Was Jordan withholding a key detail out of fear, or did his guilt run deeper? Each time she thought she was making progress, another inconsistency would crop up. One night, alone in the quiet hum of her office, she reread Melissa's journal entry for what felt like the 100th time. Trust him? With no clear context, the words almost mocked her. By the end of 3 months, the once promising case had hit a wall. Carson's team, frustrated and exhausted, began working on other assignments, knowing they couldn't dedicate all their resources indefinitely. Greystone, too, seemed eager to move on. The murder had cast a long, dark shadow over the usually vibrant coastal town, affecting tourism and local businesses. Life needed to return to normal, or as close to normal as possible when one of your brightest stars had been extinguished under such brutal and mysterious circumstances. Still, Carson refused to abandon the case entirely. She revisited the crime scene regularly, standing in the eerily quiet living room where Melissa breathed her last. She retraced the footprints and studied the patterns of the bloodstains, hoping something would leap out, some detail she'd missed before, some fragment of the truth buried beneath the silence. But each visit left her with the same unease. Everything about the scene felt staged, calculated. Someone had expected the police to find it, to analyze it, but why? And what story were they being led to believe? As public interest in the case began to wane, Carson found herself increasingly isolated in her quest for answers. The press moved on to fresher drama, and the townspeople, though still gossiping over morning coffee, grew tired of rehashing speculation that led nowhere. Even Chief Tanner began urging her to let it go. "Evelyn, sometimes there just aren't answers," he said one evening, his voice weighed with years of experience and quiet resignation. "You've done everything you can. Maybe it's time to step back." But Carson couldn't. Something about Melissa's death stuck with her, gnawed at her as she tried to sleep, followed her in the quiet moments when her guard was down. If she couldn't solve the case now, she knew it might remain a mystery forever. Somewhere, she was convinced, one of the two men knew more than they were saying, and until she could prove which one it was, or uncover the possibility she hadn't even considered, Melissa Harper's case would remain an open wound for the entire town. The revelation in the footprints. 3 months after the investigation had stalled, with leads drying up and the excitement from the media frenzy fading, Detective Evelyn Carson still couldn't let the case go. Something about it gnawed at her, like a relentless whisper echoing in her mind. The crime scene, Melissa's journal, and of course the two central suspects, Victor Lewis and Jordan Parker, had painted a vivid and complex story, but none of it had led to concrete answers. It was during one of Carson's late-night reviews of the case file that she noticed something she had overlooked before: the footprints. Footprints had been one of the first pieces of evidence collected during the initial investigation, but they hadn't seemed significant at the time. There were two distinct sets, one larger, likely belonging to a man, and another smaller, possibly a woman's or a smaller man's. At a glance, the prints had supported both Victor and Jordan's testimonies, so they were filed away as yet another frustratingly ambiguous clue. But now Carson couldn't shake the idea that maybe they needed a closer look. Footprints weren't just about size. They were about weight distribution, pace, and direction. They could tell a story, if someone knew how to listen. Carson pulled the evidence photos and began poring over them, one by one, comparing the soft impressions captured in the thin layer of dust on Melissa's floor. They ran near the back entrance, through the living room where Melissa's body had been found, and into the hallway that led to the kitchen. These footprints could hold the answer, Carson thought, and if not, she was running out of options. The following day, Carson called in a specialist, Dr. Henry Voss, a noted forensic podiatrist who had worked on high-profile cases across the East Coast. Dr. Voss was a sharp and meticulous man in his late 50s, with a knack for finding the kind of minute details that other investigators often missed. When Carson requested his expertise, he'd simply replied, "Send everything you have. I'll come down tomorrow." Within hours of his arrival at the precinct, Voss had transformed a small conference room into his own forensic lab. Photographs of the footprints, enhanced by specialized imaging software, were pinned to a board. Voss examined them with the intensity of a man deciphering an ancient manuscript. Each print was analyzed for depth, spacing, and alignment, and compared to countless forensic data points he'd brought with him on his laptop. "It's not just about who the footprints belong to," Voss explained as Carson stood nearby, watching his work closely. "It's about when they were made. The patterns here tell us about movement, timing, and sequence." "What are you seeing?" Carson asked, leaning forward. Voss pointed to a close-up shot of a larger print leading away from Melissa's living room. "This one," he said, "is still relatively fresh. Notice how sharply defined the edges are compared to this print over here." He moved his finger to another photo, one of the smaller footprints heading in the opposite direction. "These prints don't seem to have been made at the same time," Voss explained. "In fact, I'd wager good money they were made hours apart." Carson froze. "What do you mean, hours apart?" Voss nodded, confirming her suspicions before she could even finish processing it. "You're looking at two distinct sets of movements here. What likely happened is that someone entered the house first, based on the smaller prints, and left some time later. The larger prints belong to someone who arrived afterward." Voss glanced at Carson. "If my analysis is correct, they never crossed paths." Carson's mind raced. This quietly shattered everything the investigation had hinged on. From the beginning, they'd assumed Victor and Jordan had encountered each other at the scene, just as both had claimed in their interviews. Victor had accused Jordan of being there when he walked in. Jordan contended that Victor had arrived angry and confrontational, but if the two men were never in the house at the same time, it fundamentally changed the timeline of events, and raised new questions about who was lying and why. "Can we say for certain who came first?" Carson asked, keeping her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her mind. "Yes," Voss replied confidently. "Based on my calculations, the smaller footprints, likely Jordan Parker's, were made first. He entered the house, moved through the living room, and then left. The larger prints, Victor's, appear fresher, suggesting he came after Jordan left." "But why?" Carson murmured aloud, more to herself than Voss. "So Jordan was there, then left before Melissa was killed? Or could it be that Victor arrived later and found—" Her voice trailed off as a horrifying possibility gripped her. "No. What if Victor arrived after Melissa was already attacked?" "That's a possibility," Voss said carefully, picking up on her train of thought. "But one thing's for sure. The footprints say they were not there together. You're dealing with two different moments in time and possibly two separate motivations." The discovery left Carson reeling. Melissa's murder had always seemed tangled in emotion, a crime of passion fueled by jealousy or betrayal. But now, it seemed more systematic, more deliberate. Who would have left and then allowed someone else to stumble upon the scene? Or had both men unwittingly stepped into a trap laid by someone else entirely? "There's one more thing," Voss added, pulling Carson from her thoughts. "Look here." He pointed to the small footprints again. "Notice the angle of the heels. Whoever made these prints wasn't just walking. They were running." "Running?" Carson asked, her voice sharp with curiosity. He nodded. "See the uneven weight distribution? It's consistent with someone trying to get out of the house in a hurry, as if they were panicking." Carson's gut tightened. Why was Jordan running? And running from what? Or whom? This revelation gave Carson the breakthrough she'd been waiting for, but it also opened a Pandora's box of new questions. Who was lying? Who was running? And most importantly, was Melissa even alive during both encounters? For the first time in weeks, Carson felt a sense of clarity, tempered with the unsettling weight of knowing that the case was darker and more twisted than she had initially imagined. The unspoken truths. Digging deeper into Melissa Harper's life, Detective Evelyn Carson had begun to uncover a side of the brilliant young writer that had remained hidden beneath her polished public persona. Melissa had been adored by locals in Greystone for her wit, creativity, and approachable demeanor. To her neighbors, she was the rising star who never forgot her roots. But beneath that facade, the late smiles at the summer festival, the polite nods while walking her dog, lay layers of complicated relationships, unresolved grievances, and secrets that no one wanted to talk about. At first, these secrets emerged like half-whispered rumors, barely loud enough to be heard over the noise of the investigation, a gossipy neighbor here, an overheard conversation over coffee at the diner there. But as Carson continued her relentless search, a darker picture came into focus, one that painted Melissa as far less innocent, and far more entangled in the lives of those around her, than anyone had initially imagined. Melissa and Victor, a detonation, waiting to happen. Melissa Harper and Victor Lewis had once been the quintessential small-town power couple. He was the charming and successful real estate agent, a local boy who knew how to sell a dream with his perfect smile. She was the rising literary star who had turned her quiet Greystone upbringing into a story of inspiration. To outsiders, their relationship had seemed perfect, too perfect, but appearances, as Carson knew all too well, were often deceiving. Melissa's close friends, who initially hesitated to talk, concerned about digging up her private affairs, finally began to break their silence. Victor wasn't stable, one childhood friend confided when Carson cornered her at the Greystone Cafe. He could be super sweet, but when things didn't go his way, he had this temper. Melissa put on a good face, but when that relationship ended, she was relieved, like she'd dodged a bullet. Carson had delved into Victor's background and discovered several red flags. In Boston, long before their relationship, he had narrowly escaped legal trouble over a physical altercation with a former romantic partner. Though no charges had been filed, Carson couldn't ignore how the past shaped his potential motivations. According to Melissa's closest confidants, she had ended things with Victor after catching him in an affair with a younger colleague. "She told me she felt humiliated," said one friend who asked to remain anonymous, like he'd taken her for a fool. But it wasn't just the affair that had shaken Melissa. The real tipping point, it seemed, was Victor's refusal to move on. Friends spoke of his late-night calls and unexpected appearances. Carson even discovered a voicemail on Melissa's phone, saved but unheard from Victor, dated just weeks before her death. His voice sounded apologetic, pleading, and yet tinged with frustration. "I just need to talk, Mel. We never really worked this out. Don't just shut me out like this." The enigmatic best friend, Jordan's opportunism. While Victor came across as the ex who couldn't let go, Jordan Parker's connection with Melissa posed a different kind of story. Theirs was a friendship steeped in collaboration and creativity. Jordan had been Melissa's sounding board for years, helping her work through drafts of novels, brainstorming scenes, and even pitching ideas for her next big project. But no relationship was perfect. As Carson dug deeper, she began hearing murmurings of tension behind the scenes. Jordan always wanted credit, a former associate of Melissa's revealed during a quiet conversation at the police station. "I think he felt like he carried some of her projects, like she owed him something." Evidence of this subtle rivalry emerged in snippets of Melissa's emails, retrieved from her old laptop. In one email to a mutual friend, Melissa wrote, "I care about Jordan, but sometimes it feels transactional, like our friendship is tied to how much I'll let him into my creative process. He gets defensive if I write on my own, like I'm excluding him." The journals that Melissa kept, scattered pieces retrieved from her home, also painted a telling picture. One entry, a few months before her death, read, "Jordan's ideas are good, but they're not mine. I worry that if we ever part ways professionally, he'll hold it against me." Carson's suspicions of Jordan only deepened when she learned about a pitch meeting Melissa was set to attend in Boston just days before her murder. She had planned to present an outline for her next novel, a project reportedly developed without Jordan's input. The discovery stung when paired with comments Melissa had made to friends about branching out and needing to establish boundaries in her working relationship with Jordan. Had Jordan felt threatened by her desire to grow apart creatively? Did his irritation with being sidelined simmer into something darker? The third thread, an outside entanglement. Beyond her ties to Victor and Jordan, Carson also started uncovering hints of something, or someone, else. Melissa's recent journal entries hinted at a secret she had kept close to the vest. Phrases like, "I can't trust everyone," or "someone knows more than they're letting on," began surfacing in nearly every notebook recovered from her house. These notes, scribbled hastily and in disarray, suggested Melissa felt increasingly paranoid in the weeks leading up to her death. One particularly chilling observation jumped out at Carson. Written in ink smeared by what looked like a wet hand, the words read, "I saw him watching me again today. I need to say something, but what if it makes things worse?" Who was him? It didn't match the descriptions of Victor or Jordan, whom Melissa always referenced by name in her journals. A previous conversation with neighbors revealed that Melissa had once mentioned feeling uneasy about a repairman who came to fix the locks on her back door several weeks before the murder. Something about him felt off, she reportedly told a neighbor. Carson flagged this as a potential lead, though by this point in the investigation, even the smallest thread felt as fragile as a spider's web, a town full of secrets. As Carson pieced together Melissa's fractured relationships, she realized the bigger picture was even messier than she'd feared. Not one, but several motives seemed to come into play: Victor's jealousy, Jordan's resentment, and now whispers of a mysterious outside figure who may have been watching Melissa a little too closely. But most haunting of all was Melissa herself. The entries in her journal didn't just hint at paranoia, they whispered of a woman who sensed her own story nearing its tragic conclusion. Over and over, phrases like, "I need to get out of here," and "this feels bigger than me," emerged, creating a chilling sense of inevitability. Carson, though doggedly determined, knew one hard truth. In a town like Greystone, where everyone knew each other's names, nothing stayed buried for long. Except, it seemed, the real reason behind Melissa's death. The more she uncovered, the murkier the waters became, and the more elusive the truth remained. The blood spatter expert's steps. 3 years had passed since Melissa Harper's murder, but for Detective Evelyn Carson, the case remained as fresh as the day it had come across her desk. It was the one case that had gotten away, the loose thread that refused to be tied, gnawing at the edges of her otherwise flawless career. The evidence was abundant: footprints, a journal, a knife smeared in blood, but the story surrounding it was a tangled mess of contradictions. Victor and Jordan had each given conflicting accounts, and despite the intense scrutiny, the truth remained just as elusive. Desperate for answers, Carson decided to approach the case from a new angle. If she couldn't untangle the web of testimonies, perhaps the story of Melissa's murder lay in the blood itself. She called on one of the nation's top forensic bloodstain analysts, Dr. William Stern. Dr. Stern wasn't just any expert, he was the kind of man detectives called when they needed answers that mattered. With decades of experience working on everything from high-profile homicides to cold cases, Stern was known for his meticulous approach and ability to extract stories from what others saw as mere splatters. From the moment Carson reached out, he was intrigued. "Send me everything you have," he told her over the phone in his calm, bass-heavy voice. "If there's a story in the blood, I'll find it." Dr. Stern's arrival. When Dr. Stern arrived at the precinct one brisk morning, his demeanor was no nonsense. Dressed in a tailored gray suit that seemed incongruous with his line of work, he carried a leather satchel brimming with tools, data models, and case notes. Carson had cleared out a conference room for him, covering the walls with photographs of Melissa's living room and high-resolution images of the bloodstains found at the crime scene. The room's centerpiece was a large whiteboard, covered with notes and arrows tracing every known detail of the case. Carson introduced Stern to her team and gestured to the board. "What we have here," she began, "is a series of blood patterns that don't seem to tell a coherent story. Every expert we've consulted so far, it's like they're looking at pieces of different puzzles. I need you to tie it all together." Stern nodded curtly, his expression neutral. "Give me 48 hours, he said simply, "and total access to all the files." Interpreting the scene. As the team brought in piles of old evidence files and more photos, Stern began his analysis. The spatter patterns on Melissa's living room floor were his main focus. Long streaks of blood stretching away from the body, circular droplets dotting the side of a coffee table, and curious smudges on the hardwood floor that didn't match the expected flow of events. What caught Stern's immediate attention, however, were two distinct impact stains on the floor near where Melissa's body had been found. "2 attacks," Stern muttered, after only a few hours of study. He pointed to the photos while Carson leaned over his shoulder for a closer view. "This larger pool of blood next to the coffee table. This suggests Melissa fell hard here, probably after the initial attack. But here," he pointed to a smaller smear about 3 feet away, "this indicates she was struck again, sometime after already being down." Carson frowned, her brow furrowed. "2 attacks? By the same person?" "Unlikely," Stern replied. He adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to examine another photo, tracing a gloved finger over the printout. "The blood patterns suggest 2 distinct angles of impact. one directed downward like a blow to the head, and another more lateral, consistent with someone standing over her or striking from the side. The second attacker may have arrived after the first. Carson stepped back, her arms crossed. She had always suspected more than one layer to Melissa's murder, but this confirmation added a chilling dimension. "Are you saying she was attacked hours apart?" "Or minutes," Stern said. "But looking at the drying times of these bloodstains, it's definitely separate events. I'd stake my professional reputation on it." The direction of the blood. What made the scene even more peculiar was the directionality of the bloodstains. Dr. Stern used string trajectories and advanced imaging software to map the path of the blood droplets at the scene. He laid out a digital recreation of Melissa's living room, a full 3D model where he overlaid the spatter evidence. The team watched in silence as the simulation played out. "This pattern here," Stern explained, pointing to droplets that fanned outward from Melissa's body toward the kitchen. "This shows movement, likely hers. The victim was moving, perhaps crawling after the first blow, but pay attention to this." He gestured to another blood trail that led toward the back door. Someone else was moving too, someone who left after the attack. Carson leaned closer to the screen as her heart quickened. So, Melissa was crawling toward the kitchen, and the attacker left through the back door? "Not quite," Stern said, tapping his pen against the screen. "This trail belongs to a second individual. You have at least one suspect leaving through the back, but whoever made these lateral smears, they stayed behind. See how the smears get lighter? That's from a weapon or object being wiped clean." Carson exhaled sharply. "They wiped the weapon? Who does that? Someone who's calm, deliberate?" The knife, a clue revisited. When it came to the murder weapon, forensic testing had only revealed frustrating ambiguity. The kitchen knife found on the coffee table bore fingerprints from both Victor and Jordan, which might have been expected given their presence in Melissa's home multiple times. Dr. Stern revisited the knife under UV light to further analyze the secondary blood spatter patterns clinging to the blade. "These markings right here," he said, pointing just below the hilt, "indicate hesitation. There's no forceful impact here, just shallow surface contact. Whoever made the second blow wasn't as strong or committed. They might have been reacting out of fear or desperation." Carson took a deep breath. "You mean, there's a chance whoever attacked second didn't mean to kill her?" Stern gave a small shrug. "It's a theory, but intent doesn't alter the facts. Two people were here that night during her murder. One ended her life, the other likely tried to cover their tracks." Revelations and questions. By the time Stern concluded his findings, Carson's team was grappling with a mix of unease and frustration. The forensic evidence painted a brutal but incomplete picture. The staged nature of the crime scene now became unmistakable. The smears in the hallway, the splatter that stopped abruptly near Melissa's body, and the inconsistent drying times of the blood all pointed to one truth. Melissa's murder wasn't just a crime, it was a performance. Who staged the scene? Was it Victor in a fit of jealous rage? Jordan, panicking after inadvertently making things worse? Or could the mysterious third figure Melissa had hinted at in her journal, the same him she didn't trust, be responsible for pulling the strings? Staring at the 3D recreation of the crime scene and Stern's annotations scattered over the room, Carson couldn't shake the chilling realization. Melissa Harper's death had been methodical, calculated, and layered in deception. Jordan's final testimony. By the time Detective Evelyn Carson summoned Jordan Parker back to the precinct for a follow-up interview, the weight of the investigation had seeped into every corner of Greystone. Months of suspicion, blame, and anxious whispers had transformed an idyllic coastal town into a pressure cooker. While the media coverage had dwindled, the murder of Melissa Harper still loomed large in the community's collective mind, and Jordan Parker was at the center of it all. Jordan arrived to the police station looking different this time. His usually well-groomed appearance had given way to a disheveled state of exhaustion. His shirt was wrinkled, his stubble thicker than usual, his eyes hollowed out from sleepless nights. He was no longer the charismatic screenwriter who charmed his way into people's trust. He looked like a man buckling under the weight of not just the investigation, but something far deeper. Detective Carson, seated with her notebook and a steaming cup of coffee, waited silently as Jordan settled into the chair across from her. She studied him carefully, his nervous fidgeting, the way he avoided her gaze, the slight tremor in his hands, signs not of a hardened criminal but of a man being chipped away by guilt, or perhaps by fear. "Thanks for coming in, Jordan," Carson began, her tone professional but softer than usual. "I know this has been an incredibly difficult time for you." "Difficult?" Jordan repeated bitterly, forcing out a sardonic laugh. Yeah, I'd say that's putting it mildly. Carson leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on the table. I don't want to waste your time, Jordan. The evidence we've reviewed recently, especially regarding the footprints and bloodstains, has complicated this case even further. That's why I need you to clarify some things for me. Help me make sense of what happened. Jordan sighed heavily and ran a hand through his messy hair. I've told you everything, Detective. I don't know what else you're hoping to hear. Carson raised an eyebrow, continuing to scribble notes she didn't need to take, just another tactic to keep him talking. You've told me some things, she said calmly, her eyes meeting his. But not everything, and you know that, don't you? Jordan froze, his hands curling into tight fists on the edge of the table. What do you want me to say? His voice cracked slightly beneath the defensive edge. Just the truth, Carson replied simply. Nothing more. Nothing less. Let's start with the night of the murder. You said you and Melissa were going over a new project. That you left her house around 12:30 a.m., but the evidence suggests there's more to the story. We've analyzed movements in the house, the footprints, and, Jordan, we know you didn't just leave. Jordan's face went pale at the statement, his lips pressed into a tight line, every fiber of his body screaming to resist saying more. But Detective Carson wasn't about to let up. Jordan, the smudged bloodstains on the floor, the ones leading toward the kitchen, they weren't Melissa's, Carson said firmly. They show hesitation, wiping something clean. Tell me, were you trying to move something, or maybe someone? Jordan blinked rapidly, his bottom lip trembling. I didn't kill her, he whispered. It wasn't a declaration, it sounded like he was reassuring himself. I didn't hurt Melissa. Carson didn't flinch. She let the silence drag for a long moment, hoping to draw out what she sensed was teetering on the edge of his conscience. Finally, Jordan broke. I stayed longer, he admitted, his voice hoarse. After Melissa. After I found her, I stayed. The words tumbled out with the weight of months of bottled-up fear. Carson remained composed, though her grip on the pen in her hand tightened slightly. You found her? What do you mean by that? Jordan exhaled shakily, his fingers raking through his hair again as he looked down at the table. Melissa. She was already on the floor when I came back, he said softly. I didn't mean, God, I shouldn't have come back at all. But I forgot my tablet. I came back to grab it and... That's when I saw her. Carson narrowed her eyes, her voice sharp but steady. And you didn't call for help? Why? I panicked! Jordan's voice pitched higher, his words spilling out in a rush. You don't understand, Detective. I knew it would look bad, me being there. Melissa and I had been tense lately, and when I saw her like that, on the floor, the blood, I just froze. I didn't know what to do. His hands shook so badly that he clenched them into fists again as if to physically restrain his trembling. Carson leaned in, her gaze piercing. So instead of calling for help, you decided to clean up? No, I didn't. Okay, maybe I... He stammered, his face crumpling under the stress. I didn't touch her, I swear, I didn't hurt her, but I saw the knife and I just... It was instinct, I guess. He put his head in his hands. I tried to wipe it. I know that was stupid, I wasn't thinking straight, I didn't want my fingerprints on it. And yet they were, Carson pointed out flatly. Jordan groaned, his face buried in his hands. I can't explain it, I thought Victor did it. He'd been there before. Melissa said he dropped by sometimes, uninvited. She told me he was unhinged in the way he... Enough about Victor. Carson's interruption was firm but calm. Jordan, I need you to tell me exactly what happened in those moments after you found her. Did you see anyone else? Did anyone come in while you were there? Jordan hesitated, biting his lip. No, he muttered. But I thought I heard something. A noise, like footsteps. But it could have been my imagination. I don't know anymore. Where were the footsteps coming from? Carson pressed. The back door, he admitted reluctantly. Carson kept her expression fixed, not reacting outwardly. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Jordan let out a hollow laugh. Because I knew you wouldn't believe me, no one would. People already think I'm guilty because I'm the friend in the shadows or whatever. But I didn't kill her, you have to believe me. Carson studied him for a long moment. His emotions, his broken sentences, the hesitations, they felt real. But then again, so had Victor's calculated defiance. Truth and lies in the world of crime didn't often reveal themselves so easily. That'll be all for now, Jordan, Carson finally said. You're free to go, for now. As Jordan stood and exited the room, Carson sat still, staring at her notes. His testimony did shift the puzzle slightly, but it also felt incomplete. Panicked or not, Jordan was holding back something, and Detective Carson wasn't stopping until she uncovered what it was. Victor's reaction. Victor Lewis walked into the police station late on a windy evening, summoned by Detective Evelyn Carson for what promised to be another grueling round of questioning. Still dressed in his dark navy blazer and pressed slacks, Victor looked every bit the composed, successful real estate agent he had been before Melissa Harper's murder turned his world upside down. But there was something different in his eyes now, a shadow of bitterness, mixed with a simmering frustration that he was trying desperately and not entirely successfully to conceal. For months, Victor had insisted he was as much a victim in this case as Melissa. Dragged through the mud was how he had described his situation in interviews with the press, painting himself as the unfortunate ex-boyfriend caught in a web of suspicion and bad timing. But this wasn't an interview in front of a camera or a public statement. This was a closed-door interrogation with Detective Carson, and Victor knew she wasn't here for his rehearsed lines. As he sat down across from Carson in the sterile interrogation room, he let out a quiet sigh, his jaw tightening as he clasped his hands together on the table. "Detective Carson," he began, his voice measured but edged with tension, "I hope this is the last time I have to come down here. It's getting old." Carson didn't bother suppressing her pointed stare. She leaned back in her chair, notebook in hand, pen poised. "That's up to you, Victor. It all depends on how forthcoming you're willing to be." Victor let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "Am I not already? I've come in every time you've called. I've answered every question, even when they border on ridiculous. What more do you want from me?" Carson leaned forward, narrowing the gap between them. "I want the truth, Victor. No spin, no deflections, because right now the evidence, especially after Jordan's latest testimony, doesn't exactly paint you in the most innocent light." Victor stiffened at the mention of Jordan Parker's name. He looked up sharply, his jaw clenching. "Of course it doesn't. That guy's been trying to pin this on me from day one, and you're letting him." His voice grew sharper, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You know, Detective, it's funny. You keep dragging me in here, but where's Jordan? Why isn't he in cuffs yet? Everyone knows he had more to gain from Melissa's death than I ever did." Carson raised an eyebrow, her voice calm but cutting. "I wouldn't be so quick to point fingers, Victor. You had plenty to lose when Melissa cut you out of her life." Victor's eyes burned with indignation as he sat back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Cut me out? Is that what you think? Melissa and I had history, Detective. Real history. Not like whatever friendship she had with Jordan. And sure, things didn't end perfectly between us, but that doesn't make me a killer." "Then let's talk about that history," Carson said evenly, clicking her pen as she flipped open her notebook. "Let's talk about the voicemails we found on Melissa's phone." Victor flinched almost imperceptibly, his confidence faltering for a brief moment before he quickly regained his composure. "Voicemails?" he said, his tone laced with forced nonchalance. "I left her a lot of voicemails. Care to be more specific?" Carson's lips twitched into a subtle, humorless smile. "The one from 3 weeks before her murder. The one where you said, you quote, 'Don't just shut me out like this. You know we need to talk.' What was so urgent, Victor? What couldn't wait until she called you back?" Victor exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, that wasn't—" "Melissa and I had unresolved issues, all right? I cared about her. I made mistakes in our relationship, but I wanted to make things right. That's it. There was nothing sinister about it." Carson scribbled a note, her expression unreadable. "Unresolved issues, huh? Is that why you were seen showing up to her house uninvited on multiple occasions?" "I didn't stalk her, if that's what you're implying," Victor snapped, his voice rising slightly. "I visited her once, maybe twice after we broke up. We were adults, Detective. People do that. And for the record, Melissa didn't tell me to get lost. She listened. She didn't agree with everything I said, but she listened." Carson leaned in closer, her eyes locking onto his. "And that night? The night she was killed? You say you found her body after Jordan had already left. You've repeatedly painted yourself as the accidental bystander walking into a scene you had no part of. But you and I both know that doesn't add up. Victor, did you know Melissa was planning to cut ties with both you and Jordan?" The color drained from Victor's face, but only for a fraction of a second before his expression hardened. "That's ridiculous," he said, his voice flat and unconvincing. "Melissa and I had already moved past all that drama. She wasn't cutting ties with me. Jordan, sure, but not me." "And yet she called you unhinged to her closest friends," Carson shot back, keeping her tone sharp. "She told them you wouldn't let her go, that you were furious about how things ended." Victor's rising frustration was starting to crack through his calm exterior. "People say things when they're upset," he said through gritted teeth. "It doesn't mean it's true. Melissa knew I wasn't a threat to her." Carson tapped her pen on the table. "You said she knew you weren't a threat, But did she know how far you'd go when she rejected you? Let's not forget she just turned down your attempts to work things out when you showed up that night. Victor shot out of his chair, slamming his hands on the table. You don't get to twist this around on me, he barked. I didn't kill her, detective. I loved her. Carson didn't flinch at Victor's outburst. She sat quietly for a moment, letting his words and his anger hang in the air. Then, with controlled precision, she asked the question that had been simmering beneath the surface all along. Victor, if not you, then who? If you truly loved Melissa the way you say you did, why haven't you come forward with anything that could help us? Or is it because there's nothing left to say that won't incriminate you? Victor faltered, his shoulders slumping as some of the fight drained out of him. He dropped back into the chair, running a hand over his face. Jordan, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. It was him. I told you from the start, it was him. I got to that house and he was already there, standing over her. I know what I saw. Carson's eyes narrowed. And yet, the blood evidence suggests the two of you were never even in the house at the same time. Care to explain that? Victor opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since the interrogation began, he looked genuinely shaken, like a man pulled into a current he could no longer fight. Carson watched him closely, searching his face for the cracks in his story, and while the emotion felt real, the inconsistencies remained glaring. Victor, Carson said, her tone firm yet final, your story is running out of places to hide. As Victor sat in silence, staring at his clenched fists on the table, Carson couldn't shake the feeling that this was a man who was either clinging desperately to a lie, or burying a truth too painful to admit. The final verdict. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy, the air thick with anticipation as the jury filed in. After months of meticulous investigation, conflicting testimonies, and a trial that had divided the small town of Greystone, Detective Evelyn Carson sat silently in the back row, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. This was it. The moment she had sacrificed countless sleepless nights for, the culmination of her relentless pursuit of truth in the tragic murder case of Melissa Harper. Jordan Parker and Victor Lewis sat opposite one another, their composure strained but worlds apart in attitude. Jordan leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together on the defense table, a quiet desperation in his eyes as he avoided looking at anyone directly. Victor, meanwhile, sat upright, his posture painfully rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that the veins on his neck were prominent. If the trial had worn him down, he didn't show it, not as much as Jordan anyway. Victor was stubborn, always appearing defiant, dressed sharply in his pressed suit as though he were walking into a business meeting rather than a court that would decide his fate. The judge entered, calling for quiet, and the murmur in the courtroom died down to an eerie silence. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath as the foreman of the jury, an older man with graying hair, stood to deliver the verdict. "Has the jury reached a decision?" the judge asked, her authoritative tone cutting through the stillness. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreman replied, unfolding a neatly creased piece of paper. He cleared his throat and glanced at the paper, then at the defendants as if weighing the gravity of what he was about to say. "We find the defendant, Jordan Parker, guilty of murder in the second degree." The words reverberated like gunshots in the quiet room. Jordan's head slumped forward, his body sagging as though a weight had been dropped on his shoulders. He didn't flinch, didn't cry, he barely even moved, as though the verdict had drained the life from him in an instant. Across the room an audible gasp escaped a woman who had been sitting with what appeared to be his family. Victor, on the other hand, sat frozen, his expression unreadable. For the first time his bravado seemed to falter, his carefully crafted exterior cracking ever so slightly. The foreman continued, "We find the defendant, Victor Lewis, guilty of manslaughter." Victor's head snapped toward the jury and his mouth fell open in shock. "Manslaughter?" he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. He sat back in his chair, as if trying to process the implied difference between his and Jordan's convictions. His hands trembled slightly where they gripped the edge of the table. His attorneys immediately leaned in to whisper something, but Victor waved them off with a flick of his hand. The judge addressed the rest of the court confidently, her words steady and deliberate. "Jordan Parker is hereby sentenced to 25 years in prison for second-degree murder, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Victor Lewis is sentenced to 15 years for manslaughter, eligible for parole after 10. She struck the gavel, but the sound didn't signal relief or finality, only a mixture of confusion, sorrow, and muted outrage. Two guilty men, two different stories. The crowd in the courtroom erupted into a mix of gasps and subdued murmurs. Melissa Harper's parents, seated in the first row, exchanged a trembling glance but didn't speak. Her mother, a petite woman with tear-streaked cheeks, clutched a crumpled tissue in her hand so tightly it looked as though it might tear. Her father sat stone-faced, his jaw set like steel, staring at the floor in stoic silence. For Carson, this should have felt like a victory, a righteous culmination of exhaustive evidence, cross-examinations, and piecing together Melissa's final moments. Instead, it felt hauntingly incomplete. She'd brought 2 men to justice, yes, but so many questions lingered. Did either of these men truly tell the whole truth on the stand? Was Melissa's death truly the result of Jordan's panicked actions or Victor's calculated rage? Or was one of them merely covering for something deeper, some long-buried secret neither was brave enough to confess? Carson's thoughts drifted back to the evidence, Melissa's cryptic journal entry. Trust him? Whom had she been referring to? That singular phrase gnawed at Carson like an itch she couldn't scratch. The footprints, the blood patterns, the wiped knife, all pointed to a shared guilt between Jordan and Victor, and yet there were dark corners of this story that no trial, no forensic test, no line of questioning had fully illuminated. Victor's last words. As the courtroom began to thin out, Victor leaned toward his attorney, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. His expression, no longer cocky but forbidding, turned toward Detective Carson, who stood near the back and watched everything in silence. Their eyes met. "Detective," Victor called from across the room, his voice calm but laced with anger. "You got it wrong." He smirked faintly, though his eyes burned with an unsettling intensity. "I only cleaned up someone else's mess, and you damn well know it." Carson's heart skipped slightly at his words, but she didn't react outwardly. She kept her expression neutral, nodding ever so slightly as a court officer approached Victor to take him into custody. He's lying, she told herself, or at least she hoped he was. But there was something in his voice, something cold, that left a trail of doubt lingering in her chest. Jordan says nothing. On the other side of the room, Jordan was already being led out by an officer. Unlike Victor, he didn't lash out. He neither protested nor spoke in his defense. His shoulders slumped as he shuffled toward the exit, his face a blank mask of defeat. For all his earlier emotion, all his pleas of innocence, he now looked utterly empty, as though the verdict had stolen any remaining fight from him. Carson watched him go. Jordan never gave her one last look, never offered any final words. Does that mean he did it, she wondered, though deep down she doubted even he knew anymore. Questions that linger. Despite the judge's gavel closing the court for the final time, the case felt anything but over in Carson's mind. Sitting at her desk in the precinct late that night, her hands braced against the edge of her small, orderly desk, she reopened Melissa's file one more time. The photographs of the crime scene, the journal entries, the evidence logs, they all stared back at her like a puzzle with one critical piece missing. Was Jordan's guilt the result of his panicked, clumsy attempt to clean himself of suspicion? Was Victor's smugness inside the courtroom hiding a deeper involvement? Or was there potentially another truth altogether, one they hadn't yet uncovered? For the people of Greystone, this trial offered clarity, closure even. But for Carson, it added new layers to the haunting reality of what had happened that summer night. 2 men sat in separate prison cells, guilty in the eyes of the law, yet the complete truth of Melissa Harper's death might remain buried forever. A town divided. As the weeks passed, Greystone itself struggled to move on. The courtroom drama faded, but its echoes lingered in coffee shops, along the boardwalk, and inside the humid aisles of the town library. Some people believed Jordan had acted out of jealousy, his fragile ego pushed to the brink by Melissa's independence. Others clung to the idea of Victor as a dangerous, possessive ex who couldn't handle rejection. And a few, fewer still, whispered something even darker. Could they both have been pawns in someone else's game? Could there have been a figure lurking just outside the edges of the investigation, someone so careful, so precise, that they left no footprint behind? For Carson, the answers would never be enough. Melissa Harper's case might have been closed, but it would never truly be solved. The lingering, open-ended conclusion. Greystone wasn't the same after Melissa Harper's murder. The trial was over, the sentences handed out, and yet the truth still felt like a shadow slipping just out of reach. Small towns had a way of clutching onto secrets, gossiping about them in whispers while no one dared speak the full truth aloud. Even as the courtroom doors shut and the cameras moved on, The weight of what happened that fateful August night loomed like a rain cloud over the picturesque coastal streets. Detective Evelyn Carson sat in her worn leather chair at the precinct, her eyes fixed on the dim glow of her desk lamp. The case files were spread across the desk in a pattern only she could decipher, a series of overlapping timelines, red-circled evidence diagrams, and transcriptions of testimonies riddled with contradictions. Somewhere in the chaos of it all, Carson believed the truth was lurking, but no matter how many times she retraced her steps, that final piece refused to fall into place. She absently ran her fingers over Melissa's last journal entry, preserved in a zippered evidence bag. The ink smear where Melissa had written, "Trust him?" stared back at her like an unanswered question. Who had Melissa meant? Victor, with his carefully constructed image of the scorned ex-boyfriend who claimed to have only stumbled onto a crime scene? Jordan, with his spiraling guilt and panicked confessions that tied him ever so delicately to the murder without truly explaining it? Or someone else entirely, a shadow who had deliberately stayed just outside the reach of the law, a pair of eyes watching the main players self-destruct while keeping their own hands clean? Carson exhaled sharply and stood, pacing the room as she often did when she felt the mental gears stalling. Even with the convictions, even with Jordan and Victor imprisoned, the case hung in her mind like a melody that wouldn't resolve. They'd found themselves guilty, yes, but there had been no clear victory for anyone. Not for Melissa's family struggling to make sense of their loss, not for Greystone as it grappled with the tension left over from the divided loyalties between Victor and Jordan's camps, and certainly not for Carson herself. A truth divided between two guilty men. The official story now written into Greystone's records was a fractured one. Jordan Parker, the loyal best friend, had been charged with second-degree murder. His defense framed the crime as a bungled mistake, a result of jealousy, fear, and a misguided attempt to cover his tracks after finding Melissa injured or already dead. Jordan maintained that he wasn't a killer, yet he had admitted to touching the knife, to panicking, to leaving her there without calling for help. His final testimony left more questions than answers, and his silence during the verdict told Carson one thing: Jordan either hadn't fully processed his own guilt or was keeping something even darker buried within himself. Victor Lewis, sentenced for manslaughter, remained a smoldering enigma. His sharp suits and polished veneer during the weeks of trial couldn't cover the cracks in his story. He continued pointing the finger at Jordan while maintaining his own innocence, but Carson had long suspected there was something deeply calculated about Victor. His last remark to her in the courtroom, "You got it wrong, I just cleaned up someone else's mess," echoed in her mind every time she thought of him. Was it a deflection, a taunt, or worse, the actual truth insinuating that Victor had been merely a pawn or an unwilling accomplice to something larger? The town carries the weight. Greystone struggled to heal as the months dragged on. The trial had left scars on the small coastal community, dividing neighbor against neighbor. In back rooms and diners, some swore Jordan was a manipulative opportunist, bitter over Melissa's growing independence as a rising literary star. Others believed Victor, with his turbulent temper and possessiveness, was the only one capable of such a brutal crime, and still, a smaller, quieter group whispered about Melissa herself. Could her own decisions, her secrecy, her independence, her need to keep her private life just out of reach, have led her down a path where tragedy felt inevitable? The storefronts in town returned to their usual hum of business, and the harbor once again filled with tourists snapping photos in the salty breeze. On the surface, life carried on, but just under that serene facade the town remained haunted. Sycamore Lane, where Melissa's home still sat unsold, became a place children whispered about while daring one another to approach the gate. Her former friends hosted memorial events, complete with candlelit readings from her novel, but none of them could shake the feeling of unfinished business. Melissa's shadow. And then there was Melissa herself. She lingered in everyone's memory, not just as the sweet, creative young woman they wanted to remember, but as a deeply complex figure whose true story, it seemed, would forever remain untold. Carson kept coming back to Melissa's journals, now carefully catalogued in evidence storage. On the surface, they painted the picture of an ambitious writer with big dreams and a sensitivity toward the people she brought into her life. But scattered among the pages were hints of someone more guarded, someone quietly battling her own fears and creating her own labyrinth of secrets. In one entry dated weeks before her death, Carson found a scrawled line that always left her unsettled. "There are things I can't say out loud, not even here, but I know it's too late to take any of it back." What did Melissa mean by that? Was it about Victor and his increasingly aggressive efforts to get back into her life? Or was it about Jordan, whose creative partnership with her had grown strained over the years? Or perhaps it was about the nameless him Melissa mentioned so cryptically in her final notes, a presence she couldn't trust but was too fearful to confront. Carson's last goodbye. On the 1-year anniversary of Melissa's death, Carson found herself walking down Sycamore Lane just as the sun began setting over the harbor. The air was cool, and faint traces of ocean spray floated in on the breeze. Melissa's home remained empty, the garden overgrown, and the once vibrant hydrangeas now wilted and dry. A for sale sign stood half-tilted in the yard, untouched after months of neglect. Carson stood at the gate but didn't enter. There was nothing inside the house she hadn't already seen, nothing new to discover. But as she leaned against the wrought iron fence, she realized the case had taken a piece of her she couldn't get back. For all her experience and for all the logic that her detective work demanded, she still couldn't let the case rest. A closed file wasn't the same as closure, and Carson had long accepted that the truth about Melissa Harper might forever remain locked in the hearts of the people who knew her best and failed her the most. The unknowns linger forever. Even though the court had declared 2 men guilty, Greystone would always be a town with an asterisk, a secret wound that refused to vanish. In Carson's heart the case was still unfinished, maybe it always would be. Somewhere between Victor's evasive confidence and Jordan's haunted silence sat the real story of what had happened that August night. But maybe, Carson thought, the real tragedy wasn't just the killing but all the unlived stories Melissa never got to write. Greystone moved on, people forgot but Carson couldn't. And perhaps that's the curse of an unsolved truth, that it haunts not the guilty but those who try desperately to piece it all together.